Some dogs follow people for food. Some follow them for shelter. But every once in a while, a dog follows a person for a reason that changes everything. The first time Officer Daniel Carter noticed the puppy, he barely gave it a second glance. It was just before sunrise in Cedar Ridge, a quiet town tucked between rolling hills and endless stretches of pine forest in western Montana. The streets were still damp from a light overnight rain. Storefront windows reflected pale golden street lamps, and the scent of wet earth drifted through the cool October air. Daniel sat behind the wheel of his patrol SUV, sipping lukewarm coffee as the town slowly woke around him. At 40 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades wearing a badge. His short brown hair had begun showing hints of gray near the temples, and the lines around his hazel eyes had deepened with each passing year. Most people saw a dependable police officer. Few noticed the quiet sadness he carried everywhere he went. That morning felt no different from hundreds before it, until he looked across the parking lot. A small German Shepherd puppy sat near the edge of the sidewalk. Its fur was dusty and uneven, dark sable mixed with lighter patches around the chest and paws. One ear stood upright while the other leaned awkwardly to the side. The puppy couldn't have been more than 4 months old. It wasn't barking. It wasn't wandering. It wasn't searching trash cans like most strays. It was simply watching him. Daniel glanced away and started the engine. The puppy remained still. He pulled out of the lot and headed toward Main Street. By the time he reached the first intersection, he had already forgotten about it. 3 hours later, he parked outside a hardware store after responding to a minor alarm call. As he stepped out of the vehicle, a familiar shape caught his attention. The puppy was sitting beside the front tire of his SUV. Daniel stopped walking. The puppy looked up immediately. Its amber eyes seemed strangely calm. Not excited. Not frightened. Just waiting. "Well, that's odd," he muttered. The store owner stepped outside carrying a broom. "You know that dog?" Daniel asked. The man shook his head. "Never seen him before today." Daniel crouched slightly. The puppy's tail gave a slow wag against the pavement. "Where'd you come from, little guy?" The puppy stood, took 2 careful steps forward, then sat again. As if his job wasn't to approach. His job was simply to stay close. Daniel spent the rest of the morning handling routine calls across town. A broken traffic signal. A parking complaint. A welfare check on an elderly resident. Yet no matter where he went, eventually he would spot the same puppy nearby. Outside a diner window. Across the street from the post office. Sitting beside a park bench while Daniel filled out paperwork in his cruiser. It never demanded attention. Never caused trouble. It only watched. By late afternoon, clouds drifted across the sky, turning the sunlight silver. Daniel parked near the edge of Miller Park and finally stepped out to investigate properly. The puppy appeared from behind a row of maple trees almost immediately. "Okay," Daniel said softly. "This is getting weird." The puppy sat down. A gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves around its paws. Somewhere nearby, children laughed on a playground. Wind chimes rang from a nearby porch. The puppy's eyes never left him. Daniel pulled a granola bar from his pocket and broke off a piece. He tossed it onto the grass. The puppy didn't move. It ignored the food completely. Daniel frowned. Most strays would have devoured it instantly. Instead, the puppy kept watching him as though the food wasn't what it wanted. As though it had come for something else. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Daniel heard his radio crackle with another dispatch call. He sighed and returned to his vehicle. The puppy remained seated as he drove away. Night settled over Cedar Ridge hours later. Porch lights glowed warmly across quiet neighborhoods. The temperature dropped into the low 40s. Daniel finally ended his shift and headed home. His small house sat at the edge of town, near a wooded ridge where deer often wandered through at dawn. He pulled into the driveway, tired and ready for silence. But as his headlights swept across the yard, his hands froze on the steering wheel. There, sitting beside his front porch steps, was the puppy, waiting, as if it had known exactly where he would be all along. Daniel remained inside the SUV for several seconds, staring through the windshield. The puppy sat motionless beneath the soft glow of the porch light. Its small silhouette barely moved except for the occasional flick of one ear. Most strays would have searched for food or wandered off before dark. This one looked as though it had been waiting for hours. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. Finally, Daniel opened the door and stepped into the chilly Montana evening. The puppy immediately stood. Its tail moved once against the wooden steps. Not excited. Not nervous. Just relieved. You again, Daniel said softly. The puppy took a few steps closer, but stopped several feet away. Daniel noticed how thin it was beneath the sable fur. Not dangerously thin, but lean enough to suggest several nights spent outdoors. He glanced around the empty neighborhood. No collar. No leash. No owner searching nearby. Nothing. A cold breeze drifted down from the ridge behind the house, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp leaves. The puppy remained focused entirely on him. You hungry? Daniel asked. He unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a bowl of water and some leftover chicken from the refrigerator. He placed both near the porch. The puppy approached carefully. For a moment, Daniel thought it would finally eat. Instead, the little shepherd lowered its nose to the water, took a few small drinks, then sat back down. The food remained untouched. Daniel frowned. That does not make any sense. The puppy simply watched him again. Eventually, he left the food outside and went indoors. Through the living room window, he could still see the small figure sitting beneath the porch light. Even after midnight, when he checked one last time before bed, the puppy had not moved. The next morning, Cedar Ridge woke beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. Daniel stepped outside carrying his travel mug. The puppy was still there, curled beside the porch steps now, sleeping lightly. At the sound of the screen door, its head lifted immediately. Amber eyes locked onto him. Daniel stared in disbelief. You stayed all night? The puppy stood and stretched. Its tail moved gently. Again, no demand. No barking. No begging. Just quiet presence. During the morning shift, Daniel decided to test a theory. He deliberately altered his normal patrol route. Instead of heading downtown, he drove 20 miles east toward a neighboring county road where he rarely worked. The highway cut through open ranchland and rolling grass fields. Fence posts stretched toward the horizon. Golden leaves fluttered from cottonwood trees lining shallow creeks. There was no sign of the puppy anywhere. Daniel almost felt relieved. Maybe the mystery was finally over. 2 hours later, he stopped at a gas station outside town to grab coffee. As he stepped out of the store, a familiar shape emerged from behind an ice machine. The puppy. Daniel nearly dropped the coffee. No way. The little shepherd trotted over and sat beside the front tire of the patrol vehicle. Its tongue hung slightly from the long journey, but its eyes remained fixed on him. Daniel looked around the parking lot in complete confusion. There was no possible way the puppy should have known where he was. No possible way it could have followed a vehicle traveling county roads for nearly 20 miles. Yet here it was, waiting again. The gas station clerk stepped outside carrying a box of supplies. Cute dog, she said. Yours? Daniel shook his head slowly. That is what I am trying to figure out. The puppy looked up at him as if it understood every word. And for the first time since this strange encounter began, Daniel felt something he could not explain. It was not annoyance. It was not concern. It was the growing feeling that the puppy was not following him by accident. By the fourth day, the puppy had become the most discussed mystery in Cedar Ridge. People at the diner talked about it over coffee. Shop owners pointed it out through their windows. Even the dispatchers at the police station had started asking questions. Yet nobody had answers. Nobody knew where the little German shepherd came from. Nobody had reported a missing puppy. Nobody recognized him. It was as if he had appeared from the mountains one morning and chosen a single purpose. Daniel. That afternoon, Daniel finally decided enough was enough. He parked outside the Cedar Ridge Animal Shelter, a small brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by cottonwood trees that had turned bright gold with autumn. The puppy followed him across the parking lot as usual. All right, buddy, Daniel said quietly. Let us see if somebody can figure out where you belong. The shelter manager, Linda Harper, greeted him at the front desk. She had spent nearly 20 years rescuing abandoned animals and had seen every kind of stray imaginable. But even she seemed puzzled after hearing the story. That is unusual, she admitted while kneeling beside the puppy. Very unusual. The puppy allowed her to pet him. He remained calm, friendly, healthy enough. Yet every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward Daniel. Linda scanned for a microchip. Nothing. She checked local databases. Nothing. She examined his ears, paws, and coat. No identifying marks. No clues. We can keep him here for a few days, she offered. If somebody is looking for him, they will call. Daniel nodded. He knew it was the responsible thing to do. Still, as he turned toward the exit, He felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. The puppy stood immediately. A soft whine escaped his throat. Daniel stopped. For the first time, the little shepherd looked worried. Not frightened, not panicked, just disappointed. The sound lingered in the room. Linda smiled gently. He really likes you. Daniel forced a small grin. He will get over it. The puppy remained standing by the kennel gate as Daniel walked away. His amber eyes followed every step. That night, rain tapped softly against the windows of Daniel's house. The town disappeared beneath low clouds and drifting fog. He spent the evening reading reports and trying not to think about the strange animal that had somehow woven itself into his routine. Around 10 o'clock, he glanced outside out of habit. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. For the first time all week, nobody was waiting there. Daniel told himself that should have felt normal. Instead, the silence seemed oddly noticeable. The next morning, he arrived at the station before sunrise. The air smelled of rain-soaked pine. The sky remained dark blue along the horizon. As he stepped from his vehicle, one of the night deputies looked up from his coffee. "You lose something?" Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The deputy pointed toward the front entrance. Daniel followed his gaze and froze. Curled beside the station doors was the puppy, wet from the night rain. Exhausted, mud clung to his paws. His fur hung damp and tangled. Yet the moment he saw Daniel, his tail began to move. Slowly, faithfully, as though finding him again was the only thing that mattered. Daniel stared in disbelief. The shelter sat nearly 20 miles away. There was no logical explanation. No way a young puppy should have known where to go. No way he should have traveled that far alone. Officers emerging from the station stopped to watch. "That is him?" one asked. Daniel nodded silently. The puppy stood and walked over. Then he sat directly beside Daniel's boot and rested his head against his leg. Not seeking comfort, not seeking food, as if quietly announcing that he had finally returned to where he belonged. And for the first time, Daniel stopped wondering how the puppy kept finding him. A different question had begun to take shape. Why was the puppy trying so hard to stay close in the first place? The days that followed only deepened the mystery. Nobody questioned the puppy's presence anymore. The officers at the station had grown used to seeing him stretched across the lobby floor or waiting patiently beside Daniel's patrol vehicle. Someone placed a folded blanket near Daniel's desk. Another officer brought a bag of puppy food. Yet despite all the attention, the little German shepherd remained focused on one person, Daniel. It became impossible to ignore. If another officer called the puppy over, he might wag politely or accept a quick scratch behind the ears, but his eyes always drifted back toward Daniel. If Daniel left a room, the puppy quietly stood and followed. If Daniel worked late, the puppy stayed awake. If Daniel stepped outside, the puppy appeared beside him within seconds. It was as though an invisible thread connected them. One cold afternoon, Daniel sat alone in his office completing paperwork. Gray clouds pressed low against the mountains beyond town. Rain tapped softly against the station windows. The puppy lay sleeping near the desk. For nearly an hour, nothing unusual happened. Then Daniel reached into his pocket to check the time. The moment he pulled out his watch, the puppy's head snapped upward. Daniel paused. The puppy was suddenly alert. His ears stood tall. His amber eyes locked onto the old silver watch in Daniel's hand. Slowly, the puppy rose and approached. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" The puppy lowered his nose toward the watch. Not the hand holding it. Not Daniel himself. The watch. He sniffed carefully, then sat beside Daniel's chair. His tail swept gently across the floor. Daniel stared at the worn timepiece. It was nothing special. Scratched silver. Faded leather band. A simple watch that had been in the family for years. He rarely thought about it anymore. Yet the puppy seemed fascinated by it. Curious, Daniel slipped the watch back into his pocket. The puppy immediately relaxed. 10 minutes later, Daniel removed it again. Once more, the puppy became attentive. Watching, studying, waiting. The same reaction happened 3 more times. Daniel could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. That evening, after returning home, he sat quietly at the kitchen table while the puppy slept nearby. A single lamp cast warm light across the room. Outside, wind rustled through the pines along the ridge. Daniel turned the watch over in his hands. His thumb brushed the faint engraving on the back. The letters had worn smooth over the years, but he still knew them by heart. M.C. Matthew Carter, Daniel's younger son. For a long moment, he simply stared at the initials. Memories drifted through the silence. A bright summer afternoon by a lake. A fishing pole too large for a teenager's hands. Laughter carried by the wind. Matthew had loved the outdoors. Loved the forests surrounding Cedar Ridge. Loved every stray animal he ever found. The thought tightened something inside Daniel's chest. It had been nearly 5 years since he lost his son to a sudden illness that no amount of hope could change. 5 years. Yet some days the absence still felt fresh enough to touch. Daniel rarely spoke about it anymore. Most people in town respected the silence. The puppy stirred from his blanket and slowly walked over. Without hesitation, he rested his head against Daniel's knee. Then his gaze shifted directly to the watch. Daniel felt a chill move through him. Not fear. Something stranger. The puppy had never seen Matthew. That was impossible. Yet somehow the little shepherd reacted to the watch every single time. As though he recognized it. As though the scent trapped within the worn leather meant something important. Daniel looked toward the dark window above the sink. Beyond the glass, the mountains disappeared into shadow. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath endless miles of forest, lay answers he could not yet see. And for the first time, he began to wonder whether the puppy's appearance had anything to do with Matthew at all. The question followed Daniel everywhere over the next several days. He carried it through morning patrols, through paperwork, through long stretches of quiet highway that wound between ranches and pine-covered hills. Every time he looked down at the silver watch bearing Matthew's initials, the puppy reacted. Every single time. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Yet Daniel could not find a logical explanation. The little German shepherd remained a mystery. One Friday evening, a cold front swept across western Montana. Thick clouds rolled over the mountains, turning the sky the color of steel. By sunset, a steady rain had begun to fall. The streets of Cedar Ridge glistened beneath yellow streetlights, and most residents hurried indoors before the weather worsened. Daniel finished his shift later than usual. The station had grown quiet. Radios crackled softly in distant offices while rain tapped against the windows. He grabbed his jacket and prepared to head home. The puppy was sleeping near the front desk. As soon as Daniel stood, the puppy's eyes opened. He stretched, shook out his fur, and followed Daniel toward the parking lot. "You really do not miss a thing, do you?" Daniel said with a faint smile. Outside, the rain had become heavier. Water streamed across the pavement in narrow ribbons. Daniel opened the SUV door. Normally, the puppy waited outside until morning. Tonight was different. Before Daniel could stop him, the little shepherd jumped into the passenger seat and settled down. Daniel stared. The puppy stared back. For a moment, neither moved. Then Daniel sighed. Fine. One ride. The windshield wipers swept rhythmically as they left town. Headlights cut through curtains of rain. Pine trees blurred past on both sides of the road. The puppy sat unusually still during the drive. Not curious. Not distracted. Watching. Waiting. 10 minutes later, something changed. Daniel noticed it immediately. The puppy had become alert. His ears rose. His posture stiffened. He shifted forward in the seat and stared through the windshield. "What is it?" Daniel asked. The puppy let out a short whine. Then another. They approached a fork in the road. The right lane continued toward Daniel's neighborhood. The left lane led into the foothills beyond town, where dense forest covered the mountainsides for miles. The puppy suddenly stood. He placed both front paws against the dashboard and stared toward the left road. A soft sound escaped his throat. Daniel slowed the vehicle. "You want to go that way?" The puppy immediately looked at him, then back toward the forest road, then back to Daniel again. The message felt unmistakable. Daniel laughed quietly at himself. Now I am taking directions from a puppy. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something important was happening. Curiosity finally won. He turned left. The road narrowed as they climbed into the hills. Rain drummed against the roof. Fog drifted between towering pines. The farther they traveled, the more focused the puppy became. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Daniel had not driven this route in years. The forest grew thicker. Cell service faded. The only sounds were rain, wind, and the steady hum of tires against wet pavement. Finally, the puppy barked once. The first real bark Daniel had ever heard from him. Sharp. Certain. Daniel slowed immediately. Ahead, barely visible through the fog, stood an old trailhead parking area surrounded by towering evergreens. The place looked abandoned. Weeds pushed through cracked asphalt. A weathered wooden sign leaned crookedly beside the road. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He knew this place. Years ago, Matthew had loved hiking these trails. The realization struck him like a distant echo. Before Daniel could speak, the puppy jumped down from the seat and stared toward the dark forest beyond the parking lot. Then he looked back at Daniel, waiting, as if he had finally brought him to the place he wanted him to see. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Rain whispered through the towering pines. Fog drifted between the trees like pale smoke. The puppy stood at the edge of the trailhead, watching Daniel with quiet certainty. Then he turned and trotted into the forest. Daniel grabbed a flashlight from the vehicle and followed. Wet needles softened each footstep beneath his boots. The trail wound through dense evergreens that seemed untouched by time. Water dripped from branches overhead. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a creek murmured against stone. The puppy moved confidently, never straying far ahead. Every few moments he stopped and glanced back to make sure Daniel was still there. The behavior felt less like a dog exploring and more like a guide leading someone toward a destination. Nearly half a mile into the forest, the trail narrowed. Daniel recognized parts of it now. Memories surfaced with every turn. Years ago, he and Matthew had hiked here during summers. They had spent weekends fishing, camping, and watching sunrise spill across the mountains. After Matthew passed away, Daniel had stopped visiting. The forest had become a place filled with echoes he could not bear to hear. Yet now he found himself walking those same paths again because of a puppy that should not have known they existed. The rain eased into a mist. The flashlight beam swept across fallen logs, moss-covered rocks, and clusters of ferns glowing emerald in the darkness. Suddenly, the puppy stopped. His ears lifted. His tail moved once. Then he veered off the main trail toward a patch of dense undergrowth. Daniel pushed through low branches and followed. A few moments later, he emerged into a small clearing. His breath caught instantly. At the center stood an old wooden cabin. Weathered boards leaned beneath the weight of years. The roof sagged slightly. Moss crept across the walls. Yet despite its age, the structure remained standing. Daniel stared in disbelief. He knew this place. Matthew had discovered it during a hiking trip when he was 17. An abandoned ranger cabin forgotten by time. His son had loved it. He used to talk about restoring it someday. Daniel had not seen it in nearly 6 years. The puppy hurried to the front porch and sat beside the door. Waiting, Daniel climbed the creaking steps. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and rain-soaked wood. He pushed the door open. Moonlight filtered through a cracked window. Old shelves lined the walls. A rusted lantern sat on a table. Everything appeared frozen in time. Then something caught his attention. In the far corner stood an old storage chest. Daniel approached slowly. Dust coated the lid. He knelt and opened it. Inside were several notebooks, a faded backpack, and a green flannel jacket. His heart began to pound. He recognized the jacket immediately. It had belonged to Matthew. Daniel lifted it carefully. The familiar scent was long gone, but the memories remained. As he folded the jacket back into the chest, something slipped free and fell onto the wooden floor. A photograph. Daniel picked it up. The image showed a younger Matthew sitting outside this very cabin. He was smiling. Cradled in his arms was a German shepherd dog with amber eyes. Daniel stared at the picture. Slowly, he looked toward the puppy. The little shepherd was watching him from across the room. Silent, patient, as though he had brought Daniel here for a reason that was only beginning to reveal itself. The photograph trembled slightly in Daniel's hand. Rain tapped softly against the cabin roof, while the puppy remained motionless near the doorway. For a long moment, the only sound inside the old structure was the whisper of wind moving through the trees outside. Daniel lowered himself onto a weathered wooden chair and studied the picture more closely. Matthew looked younger than he remembered, not because the image was old, but because grief had a way of freezing people in time. His son's smile seemed untouched by the years that followed. Beside him sat the German shepherd from the photograph, a beautiful female dog with intelligent amber eyes and a dark sable coat. On the back of the photo, written in faded black ink, were a few words in Matthew's familiar handwriting. Found her near the North Ridge. Sweetest dog in Montana. Going to call her Daisy. Daniel swallowed hard. He remembered Daisy now. Matthew had mentioned her during one of their final camping trips together. A stray shepherd that had appeared near the forest trails and slowly earned his trust. But Daniel had never met the dog himself. Life had become busy. Work had demanded more hours. Time had slipped away the way it always does when people believe they have plenty of it left. Carefully, He placed the photograph on the table and opened one of the notebooks from the storage chest. Most of the pages contained trail maps, sketches of wildlife, fishing notes, and observations about the mountains. Then something caught his eye. Several entries mentioned Daisy. Daniel turned page after page. October 14th. Daisy followed me again today. October 21st. Think she might be living near the ridge. November 2nd. Daisy had puppies. 4 of them. Healthy and loud. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He continued reading. The entries became more personal. Matthew described building a small shelter behind the cabin for the dog and her litter. He wrote about bringing food during weekends and checking on them whenever he visited the forest. Then Daniel reached one final entry written several months later. It was shorter than the others. Daisy trusts me now. The puppies are growing fast. If anything ever happens to me, I hope somebody keeps an eye on them. They deserve a good life. Daniel stared at the words. A deep silence settled over the room. Slowly, he looked toward the puppy. The little shepherd had moved closer. His eyes remained fixed on the notebook. Then the puppy stood and walked toward the storage chest. He lowered his nose along the edge of the wooden box and gently nudged something hidden beneath an old blanket. Daniel leaned forward and reached inside. His fingers closed around a small leather pouch. Time had darkened the leather, but it remained intact. He opened it carefully. Inside was a worn veterinary receipt from nearly 5 years earlier. Attached was a photograph. This one showed Daisy lying beside 4 newborn puppies. Daniel's breath caught. One puppy stood out immediately, a male with a distinctive patch of lighter fur across his chest and one ear bent slightly sideways. The exact same markings the young shepherd carried today. Daniel looked from the photograph to the puppy and back again. The realization settled slowly, like dawn breaking across a distant mountain. This was not a random stray. This puppy was connected to Daisy, connected to the cabin, connected to Matthew. Somehow, after all these years, a path Daniel could not yet understand had led the little shepherd directly to him. Daniel remained seated in the cabin long after the discovery. The flashlight rested on the table beside the photographs and notebooks while rain continued to patter softly against the roof. Across the room, the puppy settled near his feet, calm and patient, as though he had finally completed the hardest part of his journey. Daniel looked down at the photograph again. The resemblance was undeniable. The bent ear, the pale marking across the chest, the same intelligent eyes. Yet one question still remained. How had this puppy found him? The answer came unexpectedly. Tucked inside the leather pouch was a folded sheet of paper that Daniel had overlooked. The edges were yellowed with age. Carefully, he unfolded it. His breath caught almost immediately. It was a letter. Matthew's handwriting covered every line. The sight alone made Daniel's chest tighten. He had not seen his son's handwriting in years. For several moments, he simply stared at the page, tracing the familiar curves of each letter with his eyes. Then he began to read. Dad, if you are reading this, it probably means you finally came back to the cabin. I hope so. This place always made me feel close to things that matter. The forest, the dogs, family. Daniel swallowed hard and continued. Daisy has become part of my life out here. She trusts people again. Her puppies are growing up strong. I know it sounds strange, but sometimes I think dogs remember things we forget. They remember kindness. They remember voices. They remember who made them feel safe. Maybe better than we do. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face through the sadness. That sounded exactly like Matthew. The letter continued. If anything ever happens and these dogs are still around, maybe one of them will find you someday. If they do, do not ignore them. They always seem to know where they belong. Daniel lowered the paper. His vision blurred. Outside, wind sighed through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. The puppy slowly stood and approached. He rested his head against Daniel's knee exactly as he had done so many times before. Daniel placed a trembling hand on the dog's head. For years he had carried questions that had no answers. Regrets he never spoke aloud. Conversations he never got to finish. Grief had become a permanent room inside his heart. Yet sitting there in the old cabin, holding a letter written by his son and feeling the warmth of the small shepherd leaning against him, something shifted. Not because the pain disappeared. It did not. But because the pain no longer felt alone. Tears finally slipped down his face. Quiet tears. Honest tears. The kind that arrive after years of trying to stay strong. The puppy did not move. He simply stayed beside him. Daniel looked toward the rain-streaked window and whispered into the silence. You found your way back to me, kid. The forest offered no reply. It did not need to. In that moment, surrounded by memories, photographs, and the faithful descendant of a dog his son once loved, Daniel understood something he had forgotten. Love does not always leave when people do. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it travels through years, through mountains, through generations. And sometimes it arrives on four small paws carrying a piece of someone you thought was gone forever. By the time Daniel and the puppy left the cabin, the storm had nearly passed. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the forest seemed quieter than before. Water clung to pine branches like tiny crystals, catching the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the clouds. Daniel carried the photographs, the notebooks, and Matthew's letter carefully inside his jacket. They felt less like old belongings and more like pieces of a bridge he thought had disappeared forever. The hike back to the trailhead felt different. The same trees stood around him. The same mountain air filled his lungs. Yet the weight he had carried for years no longer felt quite as heavy. The puppy trotted beside him, occasionally brushing against his leg as if making certain he was still there. When they finally reached the SUV, Daniel opened the passenger door without hesitation. The little shepherd jumped inside and curled up on the seat. This time there was no question about where he belonged. The drive home passed in peaceful silence. Dawn arrived slowly over Cedar Ridge as they descended from the mountains. The first rays of sunlight painted the hills in shades of gold and amber. Small pockets of fog lingered in the valleys below. It was the kind of morning Matthew would have loved. Over the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The puppy officially became part of Daniel's home. The officers at the station helped choose a name. After hearing the entire story, they all agreed on one. Scout. It felt right. Scout quickly became a familiar sight around town. Children greeted him outside the diner. Shop owners kept treats behind their counters. Residents smiled whenever they saw him riding beside Daniel during patrols. Yet some habits never changed. Every morning Scout waited by the front door until Daniel was ready. Every evening, he rested near the old recliner where Daniel read Matthew's notebooks. And whenever Daniel held the silver watch bearing his son's initials, Scout still lifted his head and watched quietly. One crisp autumn afternoon, several months later, Daniel returned to the cabin. The sky was clear. Sunlight filtered through the forest canopy in long golden beams. Scout raced ahead along the trail, healthy and strong now. When they reached the clearing, Daniel sat on the porch steps and unfolded Matthew's letter once more. The words felt different now, less like a goodbye, more like a gift. Scout settled beside him and rested his head against Daniel's shoulder. Together they watched the forest sway gently in the breeze. Somewhere overhead, an eagle circled against the bright blue sky. The mountains stretched endlessly beyond the trees. Daniel smiled and looked toward the horizon. For years he believed healing meant forgetting the pain. He understood now that healing was something else entirely. It was carrying the love forward. It was remembering without breaking. It was allowing life to surprise you when you least expected it. Beside him, Scout closed his eyes and sighed contentedly. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's head and sat quietly beneath the afternoon sun. The forest remained still. The mountains remained patient. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt lost.